The International Workboat Show returns to New Orleans December 3rd. We hope to see you there.
American Maritime Voices was created to help you speak up, show your pride, and when needed, push back. The future of maritime is in your hands, and its story needs to be told. Will you help tell it?
Welcome back to the American Maritime Podcast. We're glad to have you aboard. I'm your host, Sara Fuentes, and today we are joined by Mihir Torsekar, Senior Economist with the Coalition for a Prosperous America. Mihir is a leading voice on trade and brings a unique perspective on how strengthening American industry, including our maritime sector, is essential to competing with China. Hi, Mihir. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. So to get started, why don't you tell us a bit about the Coalition for a Prosperous America and your work there on a trade policy?
Yeah, so it's Coalition for a Prosperous America, or CPA as we refer to it as. We're really driving the push to try to reindustrialize America. We feel that, over the past 30 or 40 years, we've watched the erosion of our manufacturing sector. And on the economic side of things, I'm going to look at the trade data and to kind of tell the story of where we've lost that competitiveness, and then also use that evidence to inform policy that says that we can get those jobs back and we can revive U.S. manufacturing in this country. And so recently we've been very busy with these Section 232 tariffs and the investigations, I should say, and the Section 301 investigations, particularly into shipbuilding. So we, for example, submitted comments on the Section 301 investigation into China's maritime sector, backing port fees and tariffs to push back on their state-subsidized overcapacity. And then this summer, we actually drafted legislative language for the Coast Guard Authorization Act to create a workforce and yard modernization grant programs. And the committee ended up adopting it. So our work is really at the intersection of economics, trade, and national security. So we're trying to make sure America has the policies in place to build back again.
That's great. Sounds like you guys are having a very effective year. And to talk a little bit more about those 301B policies, which, again, sort of created these fees on PRC-built ships, cargo handling equipment. As you said, CPA endorsed those tariffs as a way to counter Beijing's state-subsidized shipbuilding. How would these measures complement existing American laws like the Jones Act?
Yeah, no, so I look at the Jones Act as that it gives us a baseline. So it guarantees, of course, that cargo that's transported between U.S. ports is transported on U.S. built, flagged, and crewed vessels. So that creates a demand signal right there. And it tells investors and workers that this industry matters. But the Jones Act is not sufficient to shield us from Chinese global overcapacity. So over the past 25 years, we've seen Beijing grow its share of global shipbuilding from under 10% to more than 50%. And they did that because of massive, subsidies, cheap state financing, below market steel and other non-market practices. And so on top of that, China dominates port equipment, right? So port infrastructure, 70% of the world's cranes are produced by the PRC. And they're embedding themselves in logistics software globally with their Lojing software. So I think that's where the 301 tariffs on top of the port fees are so important, and the port fees as well are so important, because they correct that artificial cost advantage that China's policies and subsidies have created, and it helps us level the playing field on U.S. shipyards. So I do think the 301 tariffs and the Jones Act really do complement each other quite well.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Interesting point about steel tariffs. Earlier this year, we had another guest on the podcast who mentioned that these steel tariffs could have an impact on American shipbuilding and American shipyards. From CPA's perspective, how do you see these steel tariffs affecting shipyard and shipyard capacity here in the United States?
Yeah, no, so I think it's a great question. And I think it's important that we think about the way that the steel industry works. So first of all, it's a volumetric business. So mills have very high fixed costs. And the more volume they run, because they have more customers, for example, the more those costs are spread out across a broader base. And those fixed costs get dispersed a little bit better. And they're running at higher capacity utilization rates. So I think it helps to stabilize prices in the long run. And when, again, you have a thing like a demand signal in place because shipbuilding is coming online, and you've got other customers from other industries because we've got a broader, base of industrialization happening, that's more consumers for the steel industry. That enables the steel companies, the steel mills, to be able to negotiate long-term contracts with their customers where they're able to lock in fixed prices. So regardless of whatever the economic circumstances are at the time, if you have those locked in contracts in place, that can help stabilize prices. So I'm going to push back and say that these tariffs aren't necessarily going to be inflationary, as a lot of people are concerned about. The second thing I think is worth noting is that the OECD, when they've done studies about the value chain of shipbuilding, they found that steel is roughly, for some of the larger shipbuilding countries in the world, roughly 7 to 10% of the, the value of the ship comes from steel. That's not a trivial sum. It's still important, and I don't want to minimize that. But I do think that a lot of the value comes in the labor, the outfitting, the systems. So even if steel prices do move a little bit hypothetically, I think it doesn't necessarily make or break the economics of shipbuilding. What really matters, I think, for this country is that we require, we have a reliable source of domestic steel available because our steel mills are still running and operational. And then that's what I think the 232 tariffs allow us.
Welcome to American Maritime Voices, your place to be heard. As part of American Maritime, you are critical to moving and securing our country. And now you can help tell the story of maritime and be part of key decisions that affect it. American Maritime Voices was created to help you speak up, show your pride, and when needed, push back. It's free to become a voice, and we'll keep you informed of what's happening in Washington so you can help change the course of issues that matter most to you. As a voice, you'll get monthly updates, have access to podcasts and videos, and receive action alerts when your voice is needed most. The future of maritime is in your hands, and its story needs to be told. Will you help tell it?
Join us in New Orleans this December to network with thousands of shipbuilders, operators, and service leaders. The future of maritime starts at the International Workboat Show. See you there.
Right, that demand signal, regardless of what industry it is, sounds like it's critically important. And so focusing on shipbuilding writ
Absolutely.
large, you've mentioned the Chinese and the Chinese Communist Party quite a bit. Obviously, the CCP has made shipbuilding a major part of its global national security strategy. How should the United States think about the Jones Act in terms of its national security, both as a maritime law and both as industrial policy?
Yeah, so you make a great point. China's shipbuilding dominance didn't happen by accident, and it didn't happen overnight. But when they joined the WTO around the 2000-2001 period, I think I mentioned earlier that China's shipbuilding made up less than 10% of global shipbuilding, and now they're over 50%. And that's because of deliberate policies. Again, not by accident. They targeted with subsidies, cheap finance, et cetera. So the U.S., I think we have to be just as deliberate to the extent possible if we want to rebuild what we've lost. And I think that we got to look, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. We've got the policy in place of the Jones Act, for example, and that's a great place to start. Since the 1920s, it's been in place. And I think that it's not just a law. It can serve as an industrial policy anchor here, and again sends a clear demand signal that this industry matters, and it creates space for foreign investors to come in. So, for example, you see in practice, Hanwha, a Korean shipbuilder, has put hundreds of millions of dollars in the Philly shipyard, in part because they think the Jones Act is giving them a stable demand base to build from, and I think that's exactly the kind of investment that we want to attract. So in the same way that China deliberately built up its industry, I think we need to deliberately use things like the Jones Act as the foundation for our own strategy to rebuild shipbuilding capacity and counter CCP dominance.
Yeah, I completely agree. And so given all that and given that context, if the Jones Act were weakened or repealed, what would the implications be for national security and for our overall industrial policy writ large?
Yeah, so if we weakened or repealed the Jones Act, I think it would render our entire strategy incoherent. Because on the one hand, we're saying that Section 301 tariffs and Section 301 investigations, through those investigations, we are acknowledging that China is their shipbuilding dominance is a national crisis, national security crisis. But on the other hand, we'd be opening up our own coastal trade to subsidized Chinese vessels. And that's, kind of on the one hand, we're talking a big game about this being important to us, but we're not backing it up. But I think that, the repeal means that, foreign built and foreign ships are going to start dominating U.S. waters. It invites the same vulnerabilities we already see with our port equipment, where now Chinese-made cranes are in use at U.S. ports right now, and those are creating actually cybersecurity risks. Like, we've actually investigated that kind of intrusion. So I think we'd be giving away control of our entire maritime infrastructure. And I also add too that the timing couldn't be worse, because if we were to repeal the Jones Act right at a time and give away our entire shipbuilding industry, we're doing it at a time when the Arctic, is emerging as a strategic flashpoint with shipping routes opening and rare earth minerals on the seabed. And so if we give up our ability to build and crew U.S. vessels, we're basically saying to Beijing and Moscow, you take it, we're not interested. So repealing the Jones Act wouldn't just undercut shipbuilding. I think it would hand our rivals more leverage over our economy and our security at the exact moment when we need to rebuild capacity.
Right. Really good points, kind of making sure that we have a holistic and really all of government approach to these really critical issues. So CPA often emphasizes pairing tariffs with broader industrial strategy. Where does shipbuilding fit in a national strategy to rebuild America's industrial capacity?
So I think you have to think about it. Shipbuilding should be treated as a top tier strategic industry, no different than semiconductors or critical minerals or any of the other 9 or 10 or so 232 investigations that we've got under works. And to think about it, shipbuilding is not just a standalone sector by itself. It has one of the biggest multipliers in the economy. So the OECD data backs this up. They say that 70 to 80% of a ship's value comes from suppliers like steel, engines, fabricated materials, electronics, et cetera. So that means that shipbuilding jobs build and support multiple jobs throughout the economy. So when we're investing in our shipyards, we're investing in the entire industrial ecosystem. So again, I think first you've got the policy in place. You got to fix the Jones Act, keep it strong, renew it as well. And that's the foundation. And then second, you got to look to expanding financing tools like loan guarantees, investment tax credits. And then, of course, enforce the trade remedies that we've advocated for, the Section 301 port fees, the tariffs on Chinese-built ships and cranes. And finally, fund workforce programs and apprenticeships tied to steady contracts.
Really well said. So it really is kind of a strategic asset, strategic industry that needs serious investment from all aspects of government. You sort of answered this already, but given that we're in this sort of maritime moment where the administration is very strong on maritime policy, you have the Ships Act where you have bipartisan, bicameral interest in really strengthening our maritime policy. What else should Congress and the administration be doing to really lock down that shipbuilding sector, maritime sector, and make sure that we're making the proper investments?
Yeah, no. So I think, again, first step, you finalize and phase in those Section 301 port fees. That's, I think, the external shield that we need in place to prevent against Chinese subsidized overcapacity. I think, again, I mentioned the loan programs, the guarantees to add, a shipyard investment tax credit. Hanwha's already proposed something similar. And I think one thing I didn't mention is that we can leverage the Defense Production Act for critical inputs like propulsion systems and gearboxes and heavy, steel plate, because without those upstream capabilities, like yards can't build at scale. And something that this administration has been really kind of innovative in doing is looking back at some of the old policies that are already on the books, like the DPA is a perfect example. And they've been leveraging it to send a demand signal for other industries, whether it's critical minerals, whether it's in the copper sector. And I think that they can leverage it again in this instance. So again, I should also mention earlier on, I mentioned that the Coast Guard Authorization Act legislation that we put language into, that'd be something that we obviously would recommend and passing and moving forward. So that's how you begin to kind of put in place the steps to start reindustrializing the industry and cut our dependence on China.
Great. And it sounds like you guys are already having some success with your language in the Coast Guard Act and elsewhere. As we are getting close to the end here, we've talked a lot about industrial policy. Can you, let's take a step back. Why does industrial policy matter? Why does it matter that we have this capacity here in the United States? Someone's a first-time listener just finding out about industrial policy as a whole. Why does that matter that the United States has this capacity for these certain sectors?
Yeah, no, great question. So the way I think about it is that the COVID pandemic really threw into sharp relief the consequences of having virtually all of our supply chains centralized in one country that happens to be our principal geostrategic adversary, right? When the COVID pandemic hits and all of a sudden we can't find 15-cent masks that we need to put on our face as basic protection because, those supply chains are just elsewhere. That I think threw into fresh relief the importance and the importance of being able to build things in our country. It was kind of one of those moments where a crisis creates an opportunity, because then suddenly we've seen in the 5 years since this real push to understand, okay, look, we are very vulnerable in all of these critical supply chains, whether it's critical minerals, semiconductors, et cetera. And I think it is so important because we can count on our own, production in-house. We have the know-how, the competency, and we need to just trust that we can, build a domestic, robust supply chain instead of just being so dependent on foreign countries who can just cut us off on the drop of a hat. I mean, we're seeing even right now with China and the critical minerals, the game that they're playing with, charging high export or imposing export controls on metals that or minerals that we're incredibly dependent on. So I think we need to put a stop to that. And we recognize that it's important that we need to bring some of those jobs back and reindustrialize our multiple sectors.
I think a lot of America agrees with you. I think we're seeing a lot of agreement on that in this need. And so if someone wanted to get more engaged or get into your field of industrial policy and economics, what should they look to do?
Well, first, and of course I'm biased, but I would advise everyone of your listeners to get onto prosperasamerica.org. That's the Coalition for a Prosperous America's website. You'll find all the research that we've done over the years on this very issue. We have a broad coalition of members that we represent. So whatever your interests are, whatever industries you're looking at, we've probably got some sort of coverage on that. And then second of all, I think it's just important to just stay engaged on these topics. Frankly, basic things like reading the newspaper every day, go back to the old school way. That's kind of how I got interested in the field. And I think, approach these issues with a curious mind. Don't just accept the sort of mainstream voices that are telling you that this is how things are. Ask those questions for yourself and investigate. Be curious. So that'd probably be the general idea that I would suggest.
That's great advice. And finally, is there anything else that we haven't touched on that you would like our listeners to know?
So I think that, we've seen for 30 or 40 years the whole story play out of these free market ideologies, free trade. We've seen how that's played out. And I think there have been certainly some winners, but there's also been a lot of losers in that. There's been a lot of economic inequality. And I think that we now are at a pivotal point, a turning point, where we're beginning to ask those questions about how did we get to this point? What are the policies that we need to advocate for to try to redress that divide, resolve that issue? And that's where I think industrial policies become really important and critical. And that I think that's something that we should all kind of agree on. I think frankly, this has become a bipartisan issue. This is not just one political party. I think that there's a lot of a groundswell of support for these issues. So I would say that I think that's time that we all recognize that this is the critical moment. We take advantage of it and continue to, like I said, visit Prosperous America, check out the research that we're doing and see how we can all kind of together sort of advocate for these policies to reindustrialize the country.
Great. Well, we're excited to get to work. Thank you so much, Mihir, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
That's all for this episode of the American Maritime Podcast. And we hope that our audience will share this show and also go to AmericanMaritimeVoices.org and sign up to be a voice on maritime issues. Again, that's AmericanMaritimeVoices.org. Check it out. Mihir, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm Sada Fuentes signing off.